everyone. Morning and welcome to day 3 of the Literature Festival. A quick thing about the Literature Festival. The Belong Online Literature Festival is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who otherwise would face identity-based discrimination. We have programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club for inclusive literatures. You can learn more about this on our website, belong.net with a double G. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the efforts of our festival partners, our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this would not be possible. Now on to today's session. This session is on when hate goes viral, being Muslim in India, with Professor Irfan Habib, Zaidi, and Khalid Ansari. The session will be moderated by Pamela Philipose, who is presently the public editor at The Wire. She was earlier editor-in-chief of Women's Feature Services and senior associate editor at the Indian Express. Her book on India's changing patterns of mediatization, media's shifting terrain, has recently been published by Orient Black Swan. Before sort of handing over to Pamela, I want to thank Atul and Manisha, who are our sign language interpreters for this session. Thanks very much, guys. With that, Pamela, please take this forward.
Thank you, and good morning, friends. A warm welcome to each one of you. The topic we are about to discuss, when hate goes viral, being Muslim in India, is an extremely crucial one, not just for India, but for each of us as Indians. Yet I wish we did not have to discuss it. The very fact that it figures in an online literature festival like this one, that bears the title Belong, is a reminder that there are many of us who are often made to feel that they do not belong to the Republic. What does this say of that long expected tryst with destiny? Is Faiz Ahmed Faiz's words, "This surely isn't the dawn we waited for so eagerly," coming true? Was this a tryst with hatred along communal and caste lines? Was this dawn of expectation just a dawn of viciousness, of othering? We are conscious that a topic as complex as this cannot be covered in a short time that we have for this discussion. 45 minutes of presentations, followed by half an hour of questions from the audience. But even if we succeed in alerting ourselves to some of the important points of the othering of the Muslim in India, we believe it will be a valuable discussion. To try and evolve, and here I would take a bit of a liberty with the format that has been decided, in the sense that I thought, let me put all the questions that we arrived at through a process of discussion, so that the audience too is on the same page with us. And so these are the questions. We kept about 5 questions, and I repeat them here. What are some of the social, political, and historical factors that have contributed to this present moment? And how much of this hate is manufactured versus being deeply embedded in Indian society? Are there specific moments when hate crimes register a sharp rise, as for instance, before an election or during a pandemic like the one we are going through? How has this sharp spike of hate impacted Muslim identity personally as well? Will this graph of hate crime keep rising in the immediate and more long-term future, according to you, given state-directed policies like Citizens Amendment Act, National Register of Citizens, National Population Register, and so on? And finally, and this is important, and I hope we have some time for it, how might one imagine a more inclusive India for all religious identities? So with this, let me kick off the discussion. And to participate in this conversation, we have 3 fine minds. Let me introduce them in the order that they will be speaking, each for around 10 minutes or a little over. I would like to open the discussion with S. Irfan Habib, who is that rare scholar who combines humanities with the sciences, being a historian of the sciences. After teaching history, he joined NISTAD, the National Institute of Science, Technology and Development Studies, New Delhi. Until recently, he held the Maulana Azad Chair at NISTAD, at the National University of Educational Planning and Administration, New Delhi. Habib has authored several papers and books. One of his more recent books, To Make the Deaf Hear, Ideology and Program of Bhagat Singh and His Comrades, is now available in a plethora of languages, including Punjabi, Bengali, and Tamil. He has also written on jihad, orthodoxy, and modern science in contemporary Islam. He has also put together a volume of essential writing on Indian nationalism. So I think he's just the right person to kick off this debate, not debate, this discussion. And so it's over to you, Habib Saab.
Thank you, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And it's so sad that we have to meet each other in this mode. But we all know it's a global problem. And I just wish that we get out of it soon. In any case, we had so many problems to get out, but now we have the most urgent one. And so we have to escape this to do something in future. So that is the struggle every day. When we talk of all these issues which you have raised just now, I link it very directly with the concept of idea of India, the whole idea of nationalism, because nationalism is so like in today's India. If you see the debate, the whole attack against the Muslims, all attacks, most of them, are centered around the idea of India, questioning the very identity of people. You are othering them, as you, Pamela, just said. So this process is not actually new. We need to go back to its history. I don't want to go back very far into history, but to history which can be connected with our present very conveniently and easily. The history of our freedom struggle, when nationalism was being defined, when our leaders like Gandhi, Patel, Nehru, Maulana Azad, and so many others, where all of them together were trying to put this heterogeneous India into one nationalist identity against the British, the only option they had was to call it inclusive nationalism, to call it composite nationalism, to call it indivisible nationalism. No, they gave these 3-4 names, different people. Now, this nationalism included communities across India, across gender, across classes, across castes. So it actually was inclusive. So it tried to include as many people as possible. Nehru's idea of economic nationalism was also based on this particular idea, that you have to include the deprived sections of society into the wider nationalist definition which we are trying to build for India in our fight against the British. Now, simultaneously, because I don't have much time to get into the details of it, simultaneously when this was happening, we had two nationalisms competing for space. One was Islamic nationalism, another was Hindu nationalism. Both nationalisms were religion-based. They defined their identity, the identity of this nationalism in terms of religion. One was majoritarian, which actually called itself nationalist because it was majoritarian. That's what it is doing today as well, because it is the majority's country, so others have to just live. Now, so this process didn't begin in the past 6 years. That's why I'm going back to its history. It was happening during the freedom struggle itself, when we had the British to fight. There were people who were fighting their own countrymen. No, they were not fighting the British. They were actually fighting their own people. And this is what I call most of the time, that for some people, the battle was against their own people. And this battle continues even now. Now, the Islamic nationalism for 20 years, 25 years, succeeded in dividing the country, which we all saw, and created Pakistan for itself, which was based on two-nation theory. The Hindu nationalism, which was majoritarian, which was putting pressure on all those who were trying to define India in very heterogeneous terms, in terms of inclusivism, cosmopolitan nationalism, etc. They were regularly questioning them. Now, when the occasion came in 47, they said, okay, Islam has succeeded in creating a country for itself. Let us define our India as Hindu India. Fortunately, we had leaders at that time who actually questioned this whole idea. There were leaders like Patel, there were leaders like Nehru, Gandhi himself, who didn't live for very long, but Maulana Azad. All of them put pressure and created an India which was inclusive, which was secular, which was pluralist, which represented the ethos of our freedom struggle. No, this was a success of the people in 1947. So they could keep the Hindu nationalist majoritarian idea away, at least for 60, 70, 60, 65 years. Now, I raise all this because whatever we see happening today, if you read the literature or the campaigns, all sorts of struggles going on in the 1930s and 40s, you will find exactly same argument, same logic, same stress, and similar sort of attack on liberal nationalism, on people who had an idea of cosmopolitan India, composite India. So these challenges are not new. So we have a historical reasons. Yeah. So what is happening today has a history, and we have to keep in mind that history is understood properly, because we should not be surprised that what has happened to our India. It has not happened suddenly. It was there. The struggle was going on. The point is how to manage it today. The hatred which has come in, which is a subject of our discussion today, this hatred didn't exist. We have seen communal riots happen. Communities fought each other, killed each other in the name of religion. But we actually went about doing our day-to-day routine humdrum life after a while. We didn't actually live with this hatred permanently. This is what is happening today. Today we are living with this hatred 24/7. That is the main issue. Why is this has happened? And this is something which has happened because the people who are trying to divide, the people who are using this polarization, want to keep the divisive issues alive. If you see in the past 6 years, whatever the government actually did, most of the issues were divisive. Most of the issues were those issues which reminds all Indians that we have a section of population which is different from us, different from the majority. So you are reminded every day. And I don't know whether this hatred was embedded or it is manufactured. I think it is both. It is embedded as well as manufactured. And this dual pressure on our body politic of our nation is actually causing havoc. And I think I will end here because I've touched upon most of the necessary points.
I think the important point that Irfan Habib raised is this whole problem of unpacking this nationalism, unpacking the moment when we battled against our own people and understanding how that has happened. I'm so glad for some of the points you've raised, and I think that begins to give us a good foundation to our next speaker's intervention. And our next speaker is Khalid Ansari, who is presently director, Dr. Ambedkar Center for Exclusion Studies and Transformation Action. Local University, India. Ansari works in the field of social and cultural theory, combining grassroots organizing with scholarly interventions for publicizing the aspirations of the subordinate caste of the Pasmanda Muslims. I think this is an important aspect of your work, and I don't know if it'll figure in the discussion, but it will be good if it does. He was awarded the PhD fellowship, and the subject of his thesis was pluralism knowledge program was on pluralism and the knowledge combination. His doctoral work was on caste movements specifically among Indian Muslims with the University of Humanistic Studies, Utrecht, the Netherlands. He has published widely in both academic and popular, press. And I would like to now invite Khalid to tell us what he has to tell us. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone.
Good.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Pamela and Professor Habib, for contextualizing the discussion today. The questions that were raised by Pamela are too general in nature, and I don't know whether I'll be able to do justice in such a short span of time. But I'd like to flag a few issues from the vantage point of the Pasmanda movement, the movement of lower caste Muslims that I've been studying for the last few years. So to begin with, I'll begin with a few premises. First, I see caste as the storehouse of power in South Asia that organizes the domain of knowledge, wealth, sexuality, violence, and so on and so forth. So caste basically directs the political economy, and it is about the control of symbolic and material resources by the upper caste elite. My second premise is that caste is a system of, it's a hierarchical system. It's a system of graded inequality where there is an increasing scale of reverence and a decreasing scale of contempt. And Dr. Ambedkar suggested that caste could be seen as gangs, as cliques, as self-serving cliques, and therefore caste as a unit or caste as a system is also anti-national, because various castes in the hierarchical order, they share feelings of distrust, feelings of envy, feelings of mutual jealousy, and so on and so forth. So that is the second premise. My third premise is that I don't see, we should not see caste as a religious phenomena or a Hindu phenomena, but caste should be seen as a South Asian phenomena, so which cuts across religious identities. So in the case of Muslims, there is a traditional distinction between the Ashrafs, which are the upper caste Muslims that constitute about 15% of Muslim population. Then there are the Pasmanda Muslims, which is a category which encompasses the Shudra Muslims, the backward Shudra Muslims, the Dalit Muslims, and the Adivasi Muslims. So the Pasmanda Muslims, which is an omnibus category comprising of the backward Dalit Adivasi Muslims, it constitutes about 85% of Muslim population. So when we talk about the Muslim category and what does being Muslim in India mean, then coming from the Pasmanda vantage point, I would say that Muslim is not a monolithic community, but it is divided into 705 occupational jatis, biradaris, or groups. And the experience of Muslims would be different for different caste groups within the Muslim body politic. Now, once these three premises are clear, then we could go for a historical interpretation of the hatred that we face today, or the anti-Muslim bigotry that we face today. So I would go back to the colonial regime and how the colonial knowledge politics has a very robust role to play in whatever is staged as violence or as hatred in the contemporary. Now, obviously, we cannot go too back in history, but one of the very interesting things with the colonial regime installed was the hyper-valorization of religion as a category, was this understanding that religion is the overarching category in South Asia. So this construction of an all India Hindu or a Muslim community, communities with deep diversity within, it could be seen as the foundational violence which informs the violence in the last 150 years or so. So there are critical moments in the modern national history from 1850s onward at least. So 1906, we see the formation of the Muslim League. 1909, the Minto-Morley reforms. 1960, Lucknow Pact, which sealed the idea of a separate electorate for Muslims and objectified Muslims as an all-India community. Then 1919, Montague-Chelmsford reforms, which installed semi-parliamentary practices, the idea of elections, and the expansion of the franchise. So in 1919, for the first time, we are seeing a shift from elite politics to some semblance of mass politics. And this shift is very important because once you install the logic of democracy, then numbers become important. And when numbers become important, the higher caste sections within all religious identities, they feel an anxiety. And this democratic game installed from 1919 onward, we see two parallel movements. One is the movement of the politicization of lower caste across communities. So we see the politicization of Dalit Bahujan communities among so-called Hindus, and the movement of lower caste Muslim movement in the form of the Moment Conference from at least the 1920s onwards. So at one level, we see the politicization of lower caste movements across religious communities. At another level, we see the high caste sections, both within Hindus and Muslims, latching on to the Hindu or Muslim identity as a proxy for their own interests. So when we talk about the category Muslim or category Hindu from a Bahujan vantage point, it actually is a euphemism for higher caste Savarn Hindus or the higher caste Ashraf Muslims. So the so-called Hindu experience or the so-called Muslim experience is largely informed by the concerns of higher caste groups across these communities. And this is very important because at least till the 1920s, if you look at the writings of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, then in Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's writings, the term Qaum or community actually refers to the higher caste sections. For example, there's a famous speech by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in 1887, where he refers to the Muslims, the term Qaum, as the Hashimis, the Sayyids, the Pathans, the Qurayshis, and so on and so forth. So the term Qaum was largely reserved for upper caste Muslims, and for the lower caste Muslims, the term Awam was used, the commons or the plebeians, so to say. So I'm not saying that there was no sense of being a Hindu or being a Muslim pre-1850s. But what I'm suggesting is that after 1850s, there is a systematization of religious identity, which is very different from what constituted the religious experience pre-1850s. So in the first census, 1872, when the returns were out, That was the first time when it was revealed that the majority of Muslims are native converts rather than the descendants of immigrant Muslims. And it is around the 1920s when the lower caste Muslims become a feather in the cap of Islam in India. So it is the drama unfolds from 1920s onwards as democracy deepens and as the politicization of lower caste happens. And that is where the upper caste Muslims, they respond through the forces of so-called Hindu nationalism or Muslim nationalism. Even the so-called secular nationalism is informed by and large, the Hindu upper caste imagery, the Savarn imagery. So I'll come back to that later. But the key point that I want to flag is that while caste is the principle of fragmentation, it is a principle of graded inequality, it is a principle which minoritizes. Religion, on the other hand, or religious nationalism, on the other hand, is the principle of forming a political majority by the high caste sections across religions. And these two logics, the logics of caste and the logic of religion, they militate against each other. And this threat to the higher caste hegemony, this threat to the higher caste dominant across religions from the internal others, from the lower caste, from the women, from the sexual minorities, it is usually managed by displacing the antagonism to the external other. This mutual othering of Hindus and Muslims is a construct. It is manufactured in order to manage the internal challenge from the lower caste, the women, and the sexual minorities, and so on and so forth. And this mutual hatred, which was installed in the colonial era, has largely continued even in the post-colonial Indian scenario. So we see in the last many years, we see the racialization of the Hindu and Muslim community. And this racialization, it is an impossible operation because of the fragmentation of the Hindu and Muslim community into various castes, into various other identities. Since it is an impossible operation, this racialization is not possible without some kind of intellectual, cognitive, and physical violence. And that is where two logics emerge. One is the micropolitics of faith, the so-called axis of piety. So we see satsang, we see tabligh jamaat, and so on and so forth, which reproduces the Hindu and Muslim day in and day out in the form of religious institutions, in the form of the domain of piety. And at the second level, we see the riot or the pogrom as the ubiquitous phenomena from at least from 1850s, 70s onwards. And this riot or pogrom is not a spontaneous. It is not a spontaneous phenomena. This riot or pogrom is a deliberate construct. It is manufactured, it is engineered, and Paul Brazis uses the interesting phrase, the riot apparatus in India. So this violence is employed in order to construct the Hindu and Muslim. Dr. Ambedkar very clearly said that if there was no communal violence, there would be no Hindu, because it is only during the phenomena of communal violence that the Hindu community divided into various castes comes together. So what Dr. Ambedkar said about Hinduism is equally true about Muslims, because Muslims are also divided into 705 caste groups, into various sects, into various other identities, various other internal identities, and it is only the program of the riot which actually unites them into a community. It's a temporary unity, but it's a unity which works to the advantage of the high caste sections, which consolidate their politics through the Hindu-Muslim binary, through the majoritarian-minority binary, through the Islamophobia-Islamophilia binary, through the secularism-communalism binary. I mean, if you look at all these four binaries which manage the caste order in India, then both sides of these binary are dominated by the higher caste sections. Whether you take secularism, you look at all the secular institutions, secular parties, so on and so forth. You take the communal organizations, you take minority organizations, you take majority organizations, you take Islamophobia, the axis of Islamophobia or the axis of Islamophilia. it is always dominated by the higher caste sections across religions. So now, I'll just conclude by saying that there is a symbiotic relationship between Hindu and Muslim communalism. And when I say there is a symbiotic relationship, I'm not saying that these are equivalent, that Hindu communalism is equivalent to Muslim communalism. What I'm saying is, number one, that Muslim communalism, it provides a legitimating vocabulary to the Hindu right-wing forces. And second, that majority and minority, despite their internal tensions, despite their overt tensions, they always negotiate to a certain kind of equilibrium at the expense of the broad Bahujan masses across religions. I can cite a few instances of negotiations and also how this entire notion of legitimating vocabulary works. So look at the statements of the Owaisi brothers in the last few years, or the statement of someone like Waris Pathan, who says that 15 crore Muslims can tackle 100 crore Hindus and so on, or the statement of Imran Masood, who says Modi ke tukre tukre kar denge, or the recent controversy over Zafar Islam Khan's statement. And the recent there's a Twitter controversy going on about homosexuality. Why so proud? So all these kinds of statements, they provide a legitimating vocabulary and they consolidate the Hindutva forces. As far as negotiations are concerned, so there are various sites where the upper caste Hindus and Muslims, they negotiate with each other. For example, Maulana Saad, very recent this Tabligh Jamaat event during the Corona crisis. So we see NSA, Ajit Doval, having a midnight discussion with Maulana Saad. Then there is another organization which was formed in the last few months, which is a think tank of 200 or 300 Muslim elite led by NJ Khan, who's very close to one of the BJP leaders. So negotiations are happening. And then the ulama, especially the Jamatul Ulama Hind, defending the Citizenship Amendment Act on behalf of the present day government. Then Patanjali Baba Ramdev, the Patanjali brand, it was offered a halal certificate by the Jamatul Ulama Hind very recently. Or we can take the example of a conference in BHU a few years back, where Mr. Indresh Kumar, a key RSS functionary who works on Muslim issues, he was invited by an SIO, Jamaat-e-Islami-led student organization for a discussion. So all these kinds of discussions between majority and minority groups, obviously led by the higher caste across religious groups, they keep on happening day in and day out. And this hatred and this mutual violence, it actually works against the subordinated caste across religions. So I will just stop here, and I would say that the fundamental driving force of the hatred today is the monopoly and the domination of higher caste sections over symbolic and material resources. And the more the democracy deepens, the more the higher caste sections, they respond by violence, they respond by hate. And unless we democratize the material and symbolic resources of the country, unless there is equitable distribution, this violence is not going to stop. And we need to think outside the binaries of Hindu, Muslim, majority, minority, secularism, communalism, Islamophobia, Islamophilia, and so on and so forth. I'll stop here and probably follow these few points later during the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ansari Saab. You have actually taken what Professor Irfan Habib had talked about and expanded and given it that caste, that crucial caste dimension. And I think that formulation that caste is anti-national is something that we need to really put out there in front in capital letters, just as communalism is anti-national. And caste as a South Asian phenomenon, it's not limited to India. It is part of this region. And what is disturbing in your presentation was the way in which the upper castes have dominated the politics of this period. And later, perhaps when we have time, we can even look at whether it was the upper caste that dominated the national movement as well. and whether some of the tensions that we are now seeing playing out was not adequately attended to at that crucial juncture in our history. Thank you very much. And now we go on to I think we now step onto a different register, because our third speaker is Annie Zaidi, whose name first came to my attention through her exceptional reportage as a young journalist. Over the years, she has come to inhabit the world of letters in a much broader sense of the term. Apart from her journalism, she's a writer of fiction as well as a playwright. She has authored Bread, Cement, Cactus, a memoir of belonging and dislocation, Prelude to a Riot, Gulab, Love Stories, #1 to 14, Lone Turf, Bantering with Bandits and Other True Tales, and she has co-authored The Good Indian Girl. She is the editor of Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing, and Equal Halves, and is the recipient of the 9 Dots Prize and the Hindu Playwright Award for her play Untitled One. Annie, I'm really looking forward to your, you come in last, but it's a very important position you have in this discussion. And so it's over to you.
Thank you, Pamela. I think Professor Irfan Habib and Professor Khalid Ansari have both actually kind of laid out a fairly solid understanding of the socio-political context of Indian Muslims and how we are positioned, so to speak, right now. I am a writer, and I think I have always resisted, both as an individual and, by virtue of the fact of being a writer, identities and labels. I think all identities are essentially fractured. Nobody is any one thing. And if you're a writer, that's the first thing you've got to kind of address. Just as nobody is just Indian, you're also never just Muslim, and you're never just a woman. You're many things simultaneously. And all of us kind of know that. In my writing and in my work, I didn't particularly want to engage with identity. Certainly not my own. I didn't want to write quote unquote Muslim characters or what was happening to them, or from my own experience either. But I think about 4 or 5 years ago, that started to change. And one reason, of course, was that when I was growing up, it wasn't that there wasn't any discrimination at all. Majoritarianism was always there. It was in the air. You learn to cope with it in different ways. Recently, what has changed is that the public discourse has changed. The things that you could take for granted, even if you couldn't actually take them for granted or shouldn't have taken them for granted, but you did take them for granted. Things such as how the police will deal with you, how the government will deal with you, how the media will deal with you. Those things you sort of took for granted, and those started to crumble. And with that, I was forced to inhabit an identity that until then was just something, it was something in the background. It wasn't in the foreground of who I was. It did slowly it was kind of forced into the foreground a few years ago. You had to start taking sides. You had to start identifying one way or another, because then that question sort of became urgent. No matter where you went, it became in your face, that question. And suddenly, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if somebody asked, are you Muslim? Then you would say either yes or no. And, that was the end of that. Maybe you were Muslim and maybe they didn't like you, and that was it. at least in my experience. I have to keep qualifying this was my experience. I didn't grow up with immediate and tangible experience of riots, for instance. They happened, I knew they happened, but they happened elsewhere and at a distance, at a slight remove from me. Even as a journalist, I didn't actually witness anything. Things did change. Things did get, in a way, worse over the last couple of decades. But certainly, about 4 or 5 years ago, all certainties started to crumble. The certainties that the Constitution provides, the certainties that I had grown up with. For instance, when I was writing Prelude to a Riot, I didn't actually set out to write a novel about identity or faith. I had gone traveling down south, actually, and I was looking for a story on labor rights, wage conditions, welfare conditions for workers, etc., in a farming context. Identity was the furthest thing from my mind, religion particularly. I mean, maybe I was thinking of tribal identity or whatever, migrant identity, but I certainly wasn't thinking of Hindu-Muslim when I started to, when I set out on my research. When I went, especially because this was in the South, and the South is kind of known to be more secular, and it hasn't had the kind of violence that the North has seen riot-wise. And I go to this place, and it's a beautiful place, and it has the usual kind of labor contestations, but I was completely surprised and taken aback by the casual Islamophobia and the kind of conversations that were unfolding in front of me, because my first name is Annie. And, you know, when I introduce myself, particularly in the South, even if they know my surname, they don't easily know how to slot me. It's unfamiliar. So many people often start to say things that they wouldn't otherwise say if they knew that I was Muslim. So for 3 or 4 days, I was subjected to this non-stop barrage of kind of comments which were deeply prejudiced. And I was completely shocked because I wasn't expecting it there and in that context. People were being really nice to you, but were being nice to you because they didn't know who you were. And it's also possible, I realized this, that at one point somebody who had been with me, kind of helping me, driving me around, being really nice to me, a friend of a friend, was being very helpful. On the 3rd day, turned around and finally asked me, "So what are you?" And I told him, and I saw his face change, and he went very quiet because he obviously realized that he'd been saying all of these things. And then he stopped saying those things. And I realized that so much of what happens in a place comes from people feeling that it is safe to say certain things. I was just a woman. I didn't belong there. I was sort of, dependent on other people's help. These people were helping me in my research and so on. But at the same time, they felt, because of the ambiguity of my identity, they felt they could start saying certain things. If they knew I was Muslim, they wouldn't say that. They still had that little bit of shame left. They weren't violent. They weren't looking to hurt yet. And I got very frightened because I realized that they're not looking to hurt yet. But in 2 years, they could be. In 2 years, they could be saying these things to me, knowing that I am Muslim. And then I paid a little bit of closer attention to what was going around in that town, who was Muslim, who was not. I saw a lot of discussions about property. It would keep coming up, oh, these people go to the Gulf. Oh, these people are connected all over the world. Like it's some kind of thought through international conspiracy. Oh, these people are, they're very good with their hands. They know how to work. They're very hardworking. And if you're Bengali, then of course you're Bangladeshi. And if you're Bihari, then maybe you're still Bangladeshi. So all these things, that, oh, these people dress like this. These kind of conversations were unfolding around me. And for the first time, I started to take these conversations seriously. I think in the North, I didn't take this sort of conversation so seriously, actually, because it was so common. It was in the South where it was not so common that I learned to take it seriously, because I saw how the public discourse shifts, how certain things that are not okay begin to become okay. Because obviously, the things that were being said to me were also being said within the community, were being said to others to whom you thought you could talk like that. And then within the community, you start to identify Muslims who are a little bit on the back foot. Somebody who is, say, a migrant from the next town, somebody who is slightly different from you, say a different caste or a different, speaks a different dialect. And those people are the ones you first single out for some kind of persecution, and you get away with it because regionally there's already some kind of anti-sentiment directed at these people, and then that sentiment grows and grows, and you start to identify a solid block of common enemy. Those were the things that I was thinking about writing about. Ultimately, I came back and I never wrote that story. I didn't do that journalistic piece that I was planning to do because I was very shaken. And somehow that sort of didn't even seem so important anymore to kind of find out who was being paid how much money, because the hate kind of took over everything else. And then after that, I kind of just spent a year sitting back and thinking about what I had seen, how I felt about it. And I started to write these series of monologues, and then that became the novel. And then later in my new memoir as well, I addressed it more directly from personal experience about, I started to think back to my childhood and the things that had always been there, sort of the majoritarianism, whether it was diet related, whether it was clothing related, the things that you resisted and the things that you kind of went along with, language. Now recently there's this whole campaign against the Urdu script. So all of those things sort of, I started to, the question of me noticing it is kind of, it's redundant because you can't help noticing it. It's kind of shoved at you, so you can't escape it. But with every little thing, it also became clear to me that these are campaigns. These are not things that organically, it's not like, for instance, with the language issue, with Urdu, for instance, it's not like one fine day all of India sat up and said, ki, nahi, this is an alien language. Somebody ran those campaigns, and I'm sure Professor Irfan Habib can tell us a little bit more about it. But these campaigns were mounted almost immediately after independence. There was a very strict and very concerted effort to separate Hindi and Urdu. It didn't happen organically. So I think when I think about these things, what I feel, I'll just say this as a final thing, that I feel that the Muslim identity, the question of Indian Muslims, so to speak, is a manufactured one. Sometimes it is manufactured at a very local level, by samitis, by groups that want a majoritarian nation and a majoritarian polity, and sometimes it is by the mainstream polity, and those are difficult to resist, obviously, because it's an organized campaign. That's it for now.
Thank you, Annie. You brought the discussion from the macro to the micro in a way that really touches one's heart. as well as mine. Thank you so much. We have about 15 minutes before we could go to the audience. And in this discussion, I'd like to flag 3 points that emerged from the very valuable presentations made this morning. And to go to Professor Habib's point, that the legacy of this battle against one's own people actually predates today's India, but its persistence and the new forms it has taken is something that can be looked at a little more closely. Coming to Professor Ansari's point, I think the reproducing of hierarchies and hatreds through religious organizations, through riots and pogroms, and I'm glad you cited Brass, because Brass also brings in this interpretation of riots as a very important way of how the riot lives on in the minds of people. And also the symbiotic relationship between Hindu and Muslim communalism and its a higher caste nature. I think that is something that we can pause and look at a little closely. And coming to what Annie had to tell us, how the public discourse has changed and things that you took for granted are no longer the case. And perhaps that is what was happening. And therefore, you know, you started taking note of it as you mentioned in our discussion. But the important thing here is that the question you touched on later, you were sure that this was a campaign rather than an organic development. And I'd want to ask you, are we sure that it is not an organic development and that it is merely a campaign? And I think that's a very important question to unpack. So can we start in a reverse order? And I'd ask Annie to respond to some of the questions that came up in our discussion. And then we can take it from there.
To that particular point, Pamela, I believe that the reason I believe it is not organic is my way of understanding the world is to look at myself first. I examine first my own heart, and then I look around me, and then through that I try and draw any conclusions. When was the last time I hated anything? When was the last time I separated myself from anything, even as a reaction? When did I ever do that? I think that does not happen unless I'm led to it. If you ask me today what I hate, I wouldn't know where to begin. You know, I can think of individuals I dislike, but when it comes to a community or a certain symbol or a certain argument for who belongs where, I wouldn't know where to begin. And the reason is that I haven't been led to it. Nobody has taken my hand and told me, especially when I was younger, nobody has told me that, you know, you are this, they are that, and they don't belong here in that manner. And what I do see is that with lots of people, that is exactly what happens. That is exactly what happens. I remember, for instance, this film I saw, a documentary, a 2-part kind of film by, I think, Lalit. The first part is called Shakha Mein Ladka, or The Boy in the Branch, and then the second part is called The Man in the Tree. You know, it traces the RSS. Now, I'm not saying that the RSS necessarily goes around telling people do this, hate that, but they do. Their founding principles were, one of the founding principles is that it is looking forward to the establishment of a majoritarian and a particular kind of Hindu nation, not just Hindu in general, because the low caste are also Hindu, but a particular kind of vision. And one of the things that really struck me when I saw the film is that one of the RSS functionaries was interviewed and was asked, so when do you start dealing with people? And he said, Shishupan mein. The word he used was Shishupan, infancy. the training or a certain world vision, a way of looking at the world and of looking at your place and other people's place in relation to you begins in infancy. And the thing is, what is this vision that is being communicated to you? So the organization can be, as I said, it can be a small local organization. It can be a satsang group, which can also be a very positive space. The question is, who is exposing how many people to what, and what degree of organization is involved? Certainly, on the language issue, most definitely it was. If you read Alok Ray's book, Hindi Nationalism, it's most definitely talks about the creation, the nationalist movement was also tied up with the linguistic movement to particularly separate Hindi and Urdu. It didn't happen just like that. There was power. One of the power contestations was because Urdu, or the script at least, even though phonetically it sounds similar to Hindi, but the script was the Persian script in the Mughal courts. And there was one section, some Brahmins did learn it, but there was another section of Brahmins that couldn't learn it. And the lobby kind of to separate Hindi from Urdu kind of came from there. So I think, I mean, these things happen all the time, but the thing is that it would be foolish to claim that people in general want something. People in general mostly don't know what they want until you hold a vision up to them and say that want this. Yeah.
Professor Ansari, can you take it forward, some of the points that Annie has put before us within your own framework, which I find quite compelling?
Yeah, well, I would just add, or rather emphasize on a few things that I touched during my presentation. I also read a few question and answers on the chat block. So I would respond to those as well. So when I say that there is a symbiotic relationship between Hindu and Muslim communalism, the idea is not to equate the two. The point that is being made is not in terms of firepower. Obviously, RSS is a much bigger organization than Jamaat-e-Islami, with a larger cadre base than any Muslim organization. But the point that I am stressing is that Hindu and Muslim communalism, they are co-constitutive in nature. They reproduce each other. And if Islamism is led by the Sayyidwadis, the term that we use is Sayyidwad, then the Hindutva is used by the Brahmanical forces or the Brahmanwadis, right? And there is a cause and effect relationship between the two. There is a tension between these two forms of nationalism or communalism, but they usually arrive at an equilibrium sooner than later, an equilibrium which is at the expense of the Bahujan subaltern caste across religions. So that is the first point that I would like to make. The second point is when we talk about the victims, the Muslim victims, during communal pogroms, during lynchings, and so on and so forth, then obviously Muslims as a class, Muslim as a group, they are vulnerable, but there is a variegated nature to vulnerability. And this Muslim vulnerability, it has to be complicated through spatial and class categories. For example, I'll just give a few examples. Let us take the Muzaffarnagar violence. So when the violence was actually happening, then there's a community of, when the gangs, the rioters, when they were attacking Muslims, then there was a neighborhood of Muslim Jats who are known as the Mule Jats. And these gangs spared them because these Mule Jats, they are dominant communities in the region. So if we characterize Muzaffarnagar riots as an anti-Muslim violence, it would be okay at one level, but at another level, it also hides much more than it reveals, because most of the victims in the Muzaffarnagar violence were lower caste Muslims or the Pasmanda Muslims. If we take the Northeast Delhi, the recent riots in the Northeast Delhi, then what are the kind of people who constitute these neighborhoods? We'll find there are a number of migrants, skilled migrant workers from Western UP. They have migrated to these regions. So we have to complicate this anti-Muslim violence in terms of class, in terms of space, in terms of caste, and only then we get to a much more realistic picture. Related to this is the distance between the actual victims and the beneficiaries of the politics of victimhood. So the actual victims are largely the lower class, lower caste Muslims, women, and so on and so forth, while the beneficiaries of the politics of victimhood, the NGOs, the civil society operators, the journalists, the academics who represent this violence or who reap benefits from this politics of victimhood, they are largely higher caste, whether Muslims or Hindus. So
Yeah.
that is the second.
Yeah. Can we, because there's very little time left, so can I ask Professor Habib to come into the conversation, please?
No, I just want to, because there's not much time left, I just want to touch upon a few things said by both Annie and Khalid. First of all, we need to realize that I am very conscious of that fact, that I don't really represent the majority of the Muslims in all over India, because I belong to a privileged section of Muslim society, so I can't really represent that. I can't really express them properly the way they need to be expressed. Anyway, we sit in our comfort zones and talk about the problems, which we have a right to do, and we all do that and write about it. The point is the division into castes, which Khalid is rightly emphasizing, and I agree with that. So when it comes to violence, caste actually becomes, or caste association of a Muslim becomes redundant. He is just a Muslim, Now, Muzaffarnagar, because I belong to Meerut and I belong to Muzaffarnagar, both cities, and I have seen both the cities as a child. During riots also, I went to the place twice, to the camps, to deliver, to look after people, supply some food and clothes, etc. One could see those people, and Khalid is right, that they were all so poor, most of them, and their language they spoke, the way they lived, the way they dressed, they were so alien from the region. They were so different from the region. They were not really part of the. Now the camp which I saw was in a Muslim-dominated Rajput community, which are called Rangads, which are strong. And I asked them, he said, violence took place just 2 kilometers away. How was your village safe? He said, अरे सर, हमारे यहाँ कौन आ सकता है? हमारे 50 बंदूकें हैं, हमारे यहाँ कौन आएगा? So this is the reflection. You are empowered. You are armed because you can arm yourself. You have enough resources to arm yourself. So you like the oppressors, the Hindu communalists are oppressing the poor Muslim. Similarly, if they do something like this someday, they can do it, because it's actually a power. So you are perfectly right that the target is the weakest section, and they were uprooted, they were killed, etc. But the identity remains the Muslim identity, caste affiliation, etc. just goes, because it's a very convenient target, very soft target. They are not targeting them because they are pasmanda. They are targeting them because they have no money, they have no arms, nobody will defend them. So it's a soft target, and they are Muslims. So your hatred finds a convenient way to express in terms of killing, hating. Anyway, now second, I just want to touch upon what Annie said about the language. She's right. The whole issue of Hindi, Urdu comes up in the late 19th century. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan put forward a proposal before the British government of establishing a Urdu university. Immediately, groups in Banaras, led by Bharatiya Harish Chand and so many others, Raja Shri Prasad, they said, how can you establish Urdu university? If a university has to be established, then it should be actually Hindi university. Urdu is not our language. This was a shock for Sir Syed Ahmad for the first time. He never realized that a large section of Indian population doesn't really own up to Urdu at all. They don't see Urdu. He saw Urdu as a language of the Ashraf, language of the educated, because a large number of his Hindu zamidars, Hindu feudal lords, spoke that same language which Sir Syed spoke. And this is where Sir Syed actually campaigned for his whatever he did. For him, Pasmanda Muslims didn't exist, which is coming out now in so clear terms. So his own politics was confined to a privileged section, and the Hindu privileged section questioned him, and which was majoritarian section. So this majoritarian politics begins from 1890s, 1880s, the language politics. And so what is happening today is, again, has a history of about more than 100 years. The point is that whatever is happening today is not just happening now. The seeds go back to 100 years. We have been living with all these divisive political issues, divisive sentimental issues, emotional issues for so many years. Unfortunately, it has found a pedestal, an empowered position today of government and the political party which espouses these. So it can reinforce and provide support to these sort of sentiments, and so they are more threatening for us.
Thank you, Professor Habib,
I have more things to say anyway.
Yeah, I know, but I wanted to go to the audience, and I think I'll start with a question from Rana Khan. What is this normalization all about? Why is hate normalized? And what are the ways in which this normalization takes place? It's a very complex question. We cannot answer it in a short time, but I just wanted to put it there. And I think all of you can see the questions that are coming up in your box. So can you just respond to some of them? Because we now have only about 10 minutes at our disposal. So I would like to acknowledge the great involvement of our audience this morning as well. And so please answer some of these questions that they raised. So can we start with any of you, anyone from the three of you can start. Maybe we can take up Rana Khan's question first, this normalization.
The only thing I have to say is that you cannot prevent the normalization of hate without a political campaign, because one of the things we're seeing is that now politicians have started to say, maybe not politicians right at the top, but certainly politicians who are elected representatives or who have been elected in the past have started to say things that simply wouldn't have been allowed in the public discourse 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And there is no punishment for hate speech either. There are no consequences within India. There might be some abroad, but not so much now. So without mounting political pressure, I don't see how it can be done. Perhaps the other panelists have different views about it.
A comment just came in. From Theresa Rahman. She was saying, I wish there were more people from the South participating in the discussion. Unfortunately, that is something that we cannot really control, but I think it's an important point to make. Now, I would invite our other two speakers to also choose a question which they feel is important and answer it in the short time we have, which is about 5 minutes each.
Khalid has more questions here.
No, I don't know. I mean, it will take. I'll just talk about this question of normalization. So, if the thesis is correct that this violence is in order to restore the slipping hegemony of the higher caste from 1990s onwards, so I would say this violence was restorative violence from 1990s onwards. In recent years, from 2014 onwards, I would see this violence as expansionist violence. So the Savarna high caste groups, they're expanding their hegemony. So if this link between this hatred and violence with high caste hegemony, if this link is clear, then this normalization of violence cannot be fought unless that hegemony is ruptured. So that is what I have to say on the question of normalization. This is going to stay for long, and we have to fight it out democratically, obviously.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Habib, would you like to answer?
Yeah. But I just want to add what Khalid just said, because this is something which is because the political dispensation today has found this divisiveness, the strengths of divisiveness, the strengths of polarization. So it's a very convenient tool. It's a tool which can take you beyond your non-performance on economic front, your non-performance on foreign policy issues. Nobody will question you until you have divided the country, polarized the country enough. When it comes to vote, they will vote for you. They will not bother about economy in shambles. They will not bother about foreign policy in bad shape. They are not concerned about anything else. You want to keep the country divided. Till this sentiment survives, I don't think any normalization is possible. Some forces, political forces, have to come forward and question these people head on. The point is, this head-on questioning is not happening. Either political forces are too weak to question them, or they feel threatened by the majoritarian polarization, because the same polarization, because they also have to go and seek votes, and the same majority has to vote for them as well. So they cannot really come out openly, and that is the hesitation we see among the political circles who don't want to question. So till you don't do that, I don't think unless something happens and this sentiment dies down on its own. Otherwise, political forces, I don't see are ready to cope with it head on the way we want, the way it should happen.
But what about what about the mobilization we saw during the anti-CAA protests?
You see, that mobilization is very, very misleading. I don't see very much in that. That mobilization was confined, was very enclaved. So it was not a mass mobilization even among Muslims. Last sections, because I myself went around, talked to lots of people. Many people were not even clear why they are mobilizing, what is happening, what is the whole issue about it. And they were not really very much concerned about what is happening, except for some press which was reporting. And the press was reporting in a very biased way, the way we know the press reports these days. So it was, I don't think there was much hope in that. And in any case, first thing is, Muslims organizing themselves for a cause, their communitarian cause, sectarian cause, will not resolve the issue which we are confronted with. You have to take the majority of Hindu population who feels equally concerned about the plight of the Muslims. Unless that happens, nothing will change. Muslims alone can't change their future, because their battle has to be fought with the liberal, secular, composite people who believe in composite inclusive nationalism, inclusive nationalist India, which was there till some time back, which has disappeared suddenly. We had political parties in UP which actually collaborated with the Pasmanda Muslims and Dalits and backward caste Muslims, formed a sort of a nexus and made an impact. Today, we don't see them anywhere, because majority of the Hindus have become Hindus. There are no more Yadavs. There are no more Dalits, and they have decided to vote as Hindus. This is something which is what the BJP tried to do, and they have done it successfully. So Muslims on their own, I think, have no future in the political battle. They have to fight this battle along with a secular majority Hindu. It has to be a joint comprador battle to fight for the idea of India, which we all see as threatened.
I think that's a very important point you've raised, Professor Habib. But the point is that the hegemony of Hindu majoritarianism is also threatened by rising caste movements and so on. So, I mean, at the given point of time, at this given point of time, we may say that it seems to be winning. The hegemony of the majoritarian hegemony is winning. But I don't know if we can say that in the long run. I would like to believe that over a period of time, there would be resistance of various kinds. Now, for instance, just look at Black Lives Matter. I am using a foreign example only to indicate how this incipient anti-racism, which is embedded in American politics, finds various ways of surmounting the barriers of expression and coming out on the streets. And I think history is really all about the uncertainties of cause and effect. And so I would like to actually end on a more...
I would like to end on a very optimistic note. I don't disagree on that. The point is, the example you have given, you see, the Black Lives Matter, the whole movement could start in the US, in the cities. Lots of white, liberal white could participate. Right-wing whites questioned them in many cities. But in India, the same, the minority Muslim population, if they stand up for some cause and start protesting, see the reaction in India. It's not the same reaction. No, there is some space in America still, despite all the problems. Still space for people to come out and protest in public, take out demonstrations. In India, that space has lost. No, so that is the difference. We have lost that space. No, if we protest, you feel like whether they are Dalits or Muslims or any other weaker sections of society, if they come out, they are under threat. Under threat not only from the people, from the state itself. So that is the difference between the US and India.
Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in on this subject quickly, maybe in a few seconds?
Well, it's hard to say anything in a few seconds. I will say this, though, that I know that a lot of people are hungry for practical solutions, that we all know what the problems are. We all know what's happening. What can be done about it? I don't know. But I do think that one thing that everybody can do, and I think Muslims in particular can do, is to stand up to any kind of prejudice within the community. And I think what Khalid has been saying about, the Pasmanda movement, etc., I think that needs to also become mainstream discourse. I see that even now there is this resistance that Islam and Sikhism, and to a large extent Christianity too, there is this thing that no, hamare yahan to kuch nahi hota, caste, etc. So one is to acknowledge the truth of how things actually are. Second is to stop the intra-community prejudice, the sectarianism within, these divisions that happen between Shia Sunni, between the anti-Ahmadiyya sentiment in Pakistan should be a warning for us. The problem is we've never taken any warnings from everything that has gone wrong in the neighborhood. And I think one of the things Muslims, no matter how powerless they are, they can do is at least to stop the prejudice within.
Ansari Saab, would you like to weigh in on some?
Yeah, I would just say, othering and antagonism is part and parcel of all kinds of politics. The only issue is what kind of othering are we willing to choose and flag. So from the vantage point of Pasmanda movement, the Pasmanda movement has contested this idea of vertical solidarity on the level of faith, whether sare Hindu ek ho jao or sare Musliman ek ho jao. And it has urged for a counter-hegemonic pan-religion solidarity of subordinated caste, as encompassed in their slogan, Dalit Pichhda Ek Saman, Hindu ho ya Musliman. That is at one level. And the second, they have inverted the identity. For example, Ali Anwar, the leader of Pasmanda movement, he says, "Hum Shuddhar hain, Shuddhar. Pehle Mool Nivasi hain, baad mein Musliman hain." So he's inverting this entire notion of identity by placing caste identity as the primary identity when compared to religion. So I will stop here.
That is a very interesting point you made, Dr. Ansari. And I think with this, we come to the end of the session. It has been a very intense discussion, and it has had its uncomfortable moments. In fact, I feel uncomfortable talking of Muslims as a category apart, because I feel, in a sense, we need to realize that they are part of us. Part of us, when I say us, we are talking on we the people. And what we have seen is a complete unpacking of that idea and the atomization of the idea of we the people. And therefore, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think we shouldn't be too dispirited. We need to carry on. And I think the future is with us, because the future is with all right-thinking people, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
The struggles on the way are many.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela. And thank you, Professor Ansari, Professor Habib, and Annie. Thank you very much for this panel. I personally learned so much from this.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. And
Thank you.
thank you
For having us. Yeah.
Thank you for
Okay.
having us. Yeah.
And so thanks our interpreters. Thank you for tirelessly